Well, good morning, everyone. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you weren't prepared or you didn't have the tools you needed for it? I remember in my first year as a teacher, I had to teach a kid for a half hour a week. I remember when I walked in, it felt like there were 100 of them, and they were crawling all over the place. And I remember I told them all to sit down, and I think I said something like, "Okay, kids, time to sit on the carpet." And I remember they all just looked at me with this confused face, and then they just kept doing what they were doing. I had no idea what to do. I was helpless, and I was at their mercy. After what felt like an eternity, but was a half hour, the classroom teacher came back and she sang her song, and all the kids cleaned up and skipped to the carpet singing their songs. And I had never felt so helpless in my life. Have you ever had that feeling of helplessness or being overwhelmed or anxious or so worried like I did when I didn't have the tools to fight that battle? So our reading this morning, we're going to look at someone who also didn't seemingly have the tools to fight his battle. We're going to look at the judge Shamgar. Now, there's only, like a few judges, there's only one verse written about him with very few words recorded. However, what we're going to find is that he was a very faithful man who trusted completely in God, so that he could be compared to other judges more famous, even David himself. And we're going to consider his faith as an example for us living in some similar times. So in Judges chapter 3, verse 31 is the record we have of Shamgar. It says, we're told very little in this verse, but it is enough to paint a picture. We know that when we read through the account of the judges, that there's a cyclical thing happening where we can summarize it by saying there's the 5 S's: the sin, suffering, seeking a savior for salvation. And we can see and maybe suppose some of these things for Shamgar or Israel during that time. So we don't know what the sin was, but we can guess it was probably idolatry, which is usually what the problem Israel had. We can infer from this verse that the Philistines were the nation this time that God had brought up against Israel and was raiding them, harrying them, taking their land, demanding tribute from them, if not just stealing from them. They were oppressed so that they would cry out to God, as in every other case in the Judges. Shamgar was their savior, and he delivered them. However, there's one event that is specifically referred to in Shamgar's period of judging, and that's the time he defeated 600 Philistines with an ox goad. However, this isn't the only place we read about Shamgar. If we look over a couple of chapters at Judges chapter 5, verse 6 and 7, we actually gain a little more insight. In Judges chapter 5, verse 6 and 7, it says, "In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and the travelers walked along the byways. Village life ceased. It ceased in Israel." Well, these passages help us to understand a little bit more about what it might have been like during the Philistine oppression. It compares the time of Jael, which is the same as Barak and Deborah, with Shamgar's time. It says that the highways were deserted. People practiced social distancing by walking along the byways or the back roads instead. In fact, in those days, people were so afraid of the Philistines, we can surmise, and perhaps felt so helpless that they stayed indoors all the time. It says that village life ceased. Businesses were shutting down. People would not go out to the market. The Philistine oppression brought life and business to a standstill in Israel. And if we wonder what the oppression of the Philistines was like, how terrible was it? Well, we know that it's compared with the time of Jael. If we look back in Judges chapter 4, verse 3, we can read that it says, the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin, that's the king of Canaan, who was the oppressor at this time, had 900 chariots of iron. And for 20 years, he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. That word oppressed is used a number of times in the Bible, but specifically, it's a mention of when Israel was in Egypt. And it says that they served the Egyptians with rigor and they were oppressed. It also describes many other times that nations were brought up against Israel and oppressed Israel. And a number of times beyond that throughout Israel's history, where God used nations as tools to drive Israel back to him because they had gone on an idolatrous trip and have neglected their Father in heaven. And I think that we can imagine what life might have been like during that Philistine oppression, because it's very similar to how we are living our life now with isolation and social distancing because of the situation we find ourselves in. Our economy is slowing, people are out of work. There is a lot of fear. There is a lot to worry about. There is a lot of opportunity for our amygdalas and our brains to take over with anxious thoughts. Well, how did Shamgar handle it? We aren't told a whole lot. And I wonder if the situation with Shamgar was a lot like maybe Gideon. For Gideon, an angel appeared to him and gave him a task, told him what he had to do. Or maybe it was more like Samson, where things happened and he just responded. I wonder if Shamgar was a farmer and he was plowing his field or herding the oxen when the Philistines came sprawling over the hill, and he out in the open with nothing in his hand but an ox goad, which is basically a stick with a little pointy end. And I imagine him looking at an angel who might have appeared to him and saying, really? Really? All I have is a pointy stick? And I imagine the angel's response might have been just like what the angel said to Gideon. Turn over to Judges chapter 7. This is when Gideon has rounded up 32,000 men in Israel to go fight against the Midianites. And basically in verse 2, God says to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands. They had 32,000 men of Israel. And if we read later on, we find out that Midian had about 135,000. They only had 32,000, and God says, you have too many. Because if I give you this victory with 32,000, or even after 22,000 leave and there's 10,000 left, he says, if I give it to you, this victory to you now, you're going to think that you did it. That's what he says. Lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. God has Gideon whittle it down to 300. So when Shamgar says, I imagine, really? A pointy stick? The angel might have said, yeah, because if you had anything else, you'd think you did it on your own, which sounds ridiculous. That's 600 men that he'd have to kill. That's a bigger ratio than the 300 men of Gideon's that had. They had to, each one of those 300 would have had to kill 450 men. It sounds ridiculous that God would say, well, you have to use an ox goad because if any more, you think you did it on your own. But isn't that something that we would do? Have you ever asked God for help with something? You've pleaded with him. You've turned to God in prayer, and he helped you through it. He gave us the strength. He answers our prayer, and then afterwards, we forget all about it. We don't thank him for his strength, his help. God knows that just like Gideon and Shamgar, that we're just like them. If we flip over to Hebrews chapter 11, this is the chapter of the faithful. Some of the judges are specifically mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. And it says about them, describing them in Hebrews chapter 11, we'll start in verse 32. It says, by faith, what more shall we say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Out of weakness were made strong. See, that's why God pushes the Israelites or the judges into situations where they have to fully rely on him. Gideon only got 300 men against 135,000. Shamgar was given a pointy stick. He pushes us to situations where we have to fully rely on him, but we really don't like it, do we? We like to be strong. We like to be in control. We like to do it ourselves. And if you've ever had a baby or seen a baby, and as you raise them or as you see them growing up, they watch everything you do. Specifically, I think about all the times that I've seen my kids watching me as I'm buckling them up in their car seat. And at first, they watch with great interest, and then they start to try to help out. And you're like, "Oh, this is wonderful," and you help them do it. And then comes that day when you're in a really big rush and you're trying to get everyone in the car, and they throw a fit and say, "Do it self," and they don't want to rely on you anymore. Well, we're the same with God, just in bigger bodies. We want to do it ourselves. We like to be strong, and we don't want to rely on other people. So that's the account of Shamgar. And when we look through the Judges and really most of Israel's history, we talked about how we see different nations are coming against Israel to turn them back to God. But this isn't the only time that the Philistines came up as a tool. If we look a few chapters over, we read about Samson. During Samson's period of judging Israel, the Philistines were the tool to oppress a faithless and perverse nation. If we turn over to Judges chapter 15, Judges chapter 15, this is a section where Israel has decided, they say in verse 11 to Samson, "Don't you know that the Philistines rule over us? What's this you've done?" And so they bind him up, and he goes willingly, and they're bringing him down, Samson down to the Philistines. And in verse 14, we read about an account that is very similar or reminiscent to Shamgar. It says, "Then he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. And the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men." Wow, 1,000, even more than Shamgar. And do you remember how I surmised that the angel only gave Shamgar an ox goad? I wonder if the angel that placed the jawbone in that particular spot for Samson was thinking, surely if he uses a jawbone, he won't think he did it himself. Surely he won't think he did it himself. What does it say in verse 16? Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men." I have slain 1,000 men. Still, he thinks it's all about him, that he saved himself. And what is God's response immediately? Look in verse 17. "So it was when he finished speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand." And then in verse 18, "He became very thirsty. So he cried out to God, and he says, 'You've given this great deliverance.'" Finally. Finally, he starts to recognize. "By the hand of God of your servant. And now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised?" So God, he splits the rock and water comes out, and he drinks and is revived. God tries to teach him who he is really dependent on, who is the one who saves, despite the fact that Samson wanted to do it himself. It's God who provides the water. So I don't think Samson would have got it, even if God had given him a feather for the fight. And to know that, all I need to do is look at myself. How often do I neglect to give God the glory for what he has done in my life, whether it is just enough that he's provided or more than I need, or help through a stressful situation, or the opportunity to grow where I needed it. In the moment, we so easily forget God and think we did it ourselves. So there's one more example that I'd like to look at that I think is much more inspirational. And it is an example that helps us to see what faith could look like for each of us. Whereas Samson, we see ourselves there, but what's something more that we can look to? And let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 46. This is another time, the third time we're going to look at, where Israel was being oppressed by the Philistines. And just because Israel had a king these days, it didn't mean the Philistines didn't remember their humiliating defeats in their history. One of the most famous biblical accounts is of David, the anointed, who went head-to-head with Philistine the giant, who is a giant symbol for sin. If we just flip back in 1 Samuel 17, right near the beginning of the chapter, it says he had a bronze helmet. He was covered in bronze from head to toe, a symbol or a biblical symbol for the flesh. He was 6 cubits in span, another symbol of our sin and flesh. But what I think is most revealing about him, about why he represents us in terms of like our sin and our nature, our desire, is what he says in verse 10, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. His defiance of God and his absolute trust in himself, in his own strength, in his own ability to save. He was willing to gamble the decision of both nations on his personal battle between himself and the man from Israel. What this really is, this chapter, is a picture of Jesus destroying sin on the cross, which is what we're here to remember today. It's a picture of Jesus overcoming his own temptation through his life and in the garden. It's a picture of us overcoming the temptation to sin in our life when we are faced with insurmountable obstacles in our life and when we are feeling so overwhelmed, when we look up like maybe David looked up, where we might say, I just can't do this anymore. But like Shamgar with his ox goad or Samson with his jawbone, look at verse 40 of 1 Samuel 17. Then David took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. David took his stick, his staff, his stones, and his sling. And let's look at Goliath's response in verse 42. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? That you come to me with sticks. I think that Goliath knew the Philistine history. David's stick is a reference back to Shamgar. And Goliath is thinking, because he's a man of the flesh, unlike the pitiful men in my history who were defeated with an ox goad, a pointy stick, I will never be. You come to me with sticks, no problem for me. And although we aren't told what Shamgar said when he went into battle, we're told what David said. And as David is a type of Christ, David truly shows us how Jesus overcame. How Jesus overcame when he was in the garden. When Jesus overcame every time he was tempted through his life and right up until the cross. And also, brothers and sisters, how we can overcome. Verse 45 and 46. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. I come in the name of the Lord of hosts, who you have defied. Brothers and sisters, the main message of Shamgar and Samson and David is that it's not about us. Faith to overcome is about saying what Jesus said in the garden. Not my will, but your will be done. Because I trust in you. I trust in you that you can help me through this problem, through this trial, this fear, this anxiety, this temptation, when all I have is a pointy stick. And maybe we don't have the boldness of David, but maybe we can at least, just like David, recognize that the Lord of hosts is with us. Who are these hosts? Well, we talked about them in our Bible class on Wednesday night evening, that how Elisha opened his servant's eyes to be able to see that they were surrounded by the angels, his hosts. And maybe we can, with tears and prayers like Jesus in the garden, struggle and limp through our trials, but still cling to God, like Samson clung to that jawbone. The struggle is real for us every day. In us, Goliath rears his ugly head from Jesus' bag he's holding it in. Jesus has destroyed sin, but we just keep going back to it. We keep trying to overcome on our own, by our own force of will, by ridding ourselves of our worries, by carefully laying our own plans. And when we try to figure out all the solutions to all of our problems and plan for every contingency that might happen so that we don't have to worry, we forget about God. That isn't to say we don't plan. That isn't to say we don't think about what might happen. That isn't to say we don't use common sense and precautions. But if our strategy for being able not to worry is not about bringing it to God, then we're just throwing away the ox goad and picking up something that we think will be better, something we can save ourselves with, because we're going to do it on our own. We will stop worrying and fearing because we can cling to the plan that we made or that someone gave to us. Brothers and sisters, if we're honest with ourselves as we examine ourselves, as we eat this bread and drink this wine, when faced with the situation we're currently in the world, we need to ask ourselves, am I immediately thinking that God is the one who can save? God is the one that can help me through this? Or do we find ourselves thinking, when things mount, when our feelings of stress about what's happening are maybe right up to here, and then something happens and it just pushes us over the threshold, and we find ourselves saying things like, I just can't do this. And if we find ourselves saying that, we're right. We can't do this. We can't go on one more day or one more time. God is trying to get you to realize that really all you and I have is a pointy stick. And it's pretty useless to face the gigantic problems in our life. So when you find yourself fearful and anxious or angry or upset or frustrated or overwhelmed, and when the last straw is breaking, brothers and sisters, I implore you, turn to God. I get emails from work and I see messages in the media quite frequently with lots of strategies for self-care and to help people's mental health. And one of the things that keeps coming up I see is mindfulness or meditation and gratefulness. And when I read these things, I think they're absolutely right. But all of those things that people are suggesting, they're missing a big part. If we're going to meditate, if we're going to be grateful, then let's meditate on what God tells us to meditate on, because he's very specific. He says to meditate on his statutes, his precepts, and his testimonies. Look those up. And I guarantee you that if you turn to God when you're overwhelmed and you meditate on these things and these become the focus of your life, this is exactly what God wants. And you're going to find help in time of need. Tell God how you feel. Tell him your complaint and tell him that you trust him. So, brothers and sisters, as we get to the point where we're about to examine ourselves and eat this bread and drink this wine in remembrance of what Jesus did, as we look at these symbols and hold them in our hands, let's remember that they are symbols of the example for our life. That Jesus said in the garden, "Not my will, but yours be done." We see Jesus in David when he said he trusts in the Lord of hosts. And just like David, Jesus has cut the head off of our Philistine sin so that we are forgiven by his grace through our faith. So if you've ever felt like me that you weren't prepared for something or didn't have the tools for a situation, if you're ever feeling like this is too much and I just can't do it, I'm overwhelmed, then you're in good company. When we look back at Shamgar, did you know what his name means? His name means sword, and his father's name, Aneth, means answer. So, brothers and sisters, the message is that he was God's sword, the answer to the crisis, because he said, I will use the pointy stick that you gave me, and I know you, God, the Lord of hosts, will do the rest. Thank you.